Hi, I'm Callie, and my in-laws left me in Italy with nothing but a hotel key, 30 euros, and a note that said, maybe this time you'll learn. No calls, no warnings, just silence, and that smug little sentence. But here's the part they didn't see coming. I did learn something, just not what they wanted me to do. Before we go any further, tell me, has anyone ever tried to break you only to watch you rise instead? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This story might just change the way you see failure, family, and yourself. They left me in a foreign country with nothing but a hotel key and a note that read, maybe this time you'll learn. I didn't believe it at first. The bed beside me was cold, the curtains drawn open, sunlight spilling over the tile floor like a silent witness. I reached for my phone. No messages, no missed calls, just the hotel Wi-Fi login screen and a weak signal bar. Then I saw the note, neatly folded on the desk beside the untouched espresso cup Evan had ordered the night before. Maybe this time you'll learn. Vivian's voice echoed in my memory, sharp and rehearsed. You wouldn't last a day without our help. Maybe this was their idea of proving a point. I stumbled toward the bathroom, checked the counter. No toothbrushes. No suitcases. Evan's cologne, gone. His shoes, gone. Panic started as a whisper, but turned into something louder, pressing against my chest. The wallet in my purse held 27 euros and a crumpled receipt from a gelato stand. No ID. No credit card. My phone still wouldn't connect to anything but the hotel Wi-Fi, and even that kept dropping. I tried calling Evan 3 times. Voicemail. I tried texting. Where are you? Read at 6:43 a.m. No reply. By the time I stepped out into the street, the morning air bit through my light jacket. The cobblestones shimmered with dew, and fallen leaves stuck to my boots. Florence should have felt like a dream. Instead, it looked like a painting I'd been dropped into against my will. Gorgeous, detached, unreal. I wandered aimlessly past cafes setting out fresh cornetti, the scent of espresso lingering in the air. Tourists bustled with maps and cameras. I barely registered them. A police officer noticed me sitting too long on a bench near Piazza della Repubblica and asked gently, in broken English, if I needed help. I smiled, shook my head, and thanked him. I wasn't sure what help even meant right now. I sat at the edge of the square, watching a street performer sketch caricatures. His lines were fast, confident. He looked at his subjects as if he truly saw them. I wondered what he'd see in me. Lost girl, married into money, abandoned like baggage. It hit me then. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. A lesson. A punishment. And deep down, a warning. They didn't just leave me behind. They meant to. She pulled out the tiny sketchbook from her purse and whispered, "So this is what starting over feels like." The waiter brought the bill to the table and gently asked if I had someone coming to pay for me. I felt the flush creep up my cheeks as I looked down at the untouched espresso and single biscotti I'd ordered, trying to make it last an hour. The tiny cafe near Ponte Vecchio was charming, sun spilling over its mismatched tables, the clink of spoons against porcelain filling the silence. But now, the warmth in my chest had nothing to do with the coffee. "No, it's just me," I said, attempting a smile. "Sorry, I didn't realize." I hesitated, reaching into my purse and handing over my last 10 euros. He nodded kindly, but I could see the concern in his eyes. Maybe I looked more fragile than I thought. Earlier, I'd wandered aimlessly, passing shops full of silk scarves and watercolor postcards. I wasn't sightseeing. I was stalling. I didn't know what to do. No credit cards, no family, and apparently no husband. A couple at the next table caught my eye. The woman laughed at something the man said, squeezing his hand. I looked away before envy had time to take root. I remembered Vivian once scolding me for using coupons. If you can't afford quality, maybe you shouldn't be dining out at all, she'd said, sharp as ever. It had stung then. Now it rang in my ears like prophecy. The cafe owner, an older woman with deep smile lines and bright red glasses, must have sensed something. She came over, not to shoo me along, but to refill my water and press a wrapped sandwich into my hands. Per dopo, she said softly. For later. I nearly cried. I nodded instead, murmuring grazie, like a prayer. I wandered again, eventually ending up near a narrow alley lined with local artisan shops. One caught my eye. Hand-bound journals, leather tooled by hand. I pressed my face to the glass. I missed creating, drawing. I missed something that belonged to me. Have you ever felt like I do now? The feeling of being invisible, of having no one, nowhere, and nothing, until a stranger shows you the kind of kindness your own family never did. If you've ever felt abandoned, or if you've ever had to find your strength in the unlikeliest places, leave a comment number 9 below. Now, let's see what happened next in this story. Inside, a man with silver hair and a blue scarf around his neck greeted me in English. Looking for something beautiful to keep you grounded? I might be, I said, but I'm just browsing. He smiled. That's a good place to begin. He offered me a seat in the back corner, where I could sketch or just sit. No purchase necessary. Call it an artist's refuge, he joked. My sister runs the bakery next door. You'll smell almonds in about 5 minutes. I stayed until the shadows stretched long across the cobblestones, sketching rooftops and tourists. My lines were shaky, uncertain, but they were mine. And then my phone buzzed, with a single message from Evan. Are you done embarrassing us yet? He handed me 50 euros for a napkin drawing, and I forgot for a moment that I'd been abandoned. It was a windy Saturday, the kind that carries the scent of roasted chestnuts and crisp leaves down every side street. I'd taken a little folding stool and my sketchbook and settled near a lamppost outside the cafe. My fingers were stiff in the cold, but my pencil moved freely, chasing shapes and shadows across the paper. For the first time in days, I wasn't thinking about Evan or Vivian. I was just drawing. The napkin had started as a joke, something I scribbled while sipping tea, a crooked little scene of 2 elderly tourists squinting at a map beneath the statue of David. I'd left it on the table when I went to refill my water. When I returned, the man from the drawing was holding it, his wife laughing beside him. Did you make this? He asked in a gentle southern drawl. I nodded. Is just a napkin sketch? Well, we'd like to buy it, he said, smiling as he pulled out a 50-euro note. It's the only thing that's truly captured how confused we've been all week. I laughed, a real warm laugh that reached my chest. You sure? I asked, still unsure how to react. Sweetheart, his wife said, patting my arm, that little drawing is going to sit on our mantel back in Arizona. After they left, I just sat there in awe. I hadn't felt that scene in years, maybe. Vivian used to say my drawings were quaint, like they belonged on notebook covers or coffee shop menus. But this couple, strangers, saw something more. Sophia, the cafe owner's niece, came by with a tiny olive branch. It means peace and new beginnings, she said softly, before tucking it behind my ear like a crown. Jana appeared later with a brown envelope. Inside were a dozen postcards printed with my sketches. I had them made. Tourists love things with heart, she said. Yours have it. I didn't ask you to do this, I whispered, blinking fast. You didn't have to. You're already here. You just didn't know it yet. That evening, Luca stopped by to ask if I'd design a poster for a local artisan fair next month. "Just something with your touch," he said. Back in my room, I opened my sketchbook to a fresh page. I wrote my first letter since the day they left me. It was short, addressed to a future version of myself I barely believed in. For the first time since that note on the table, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I was meant to be here. I was sketching figs and olives when a voice behind me said, "So you survived." The pencil in my hand paused mid-curve. I didn't turn around right away. I let the words sink in, taste the cold metal in them, and then gently set my sketchbook down on the cafe counter. When I finally faced her, Vivian stood there like an overdressed storm cloud. Leather gloves, designer tote, oversized sunglasses perched like a shield she didn't need. Evan loomed behind her, avoiding my eyes. "Well," she said, slipping off her glasses, "this is quaint." Gianna glanced up from the espresso machine. She didn't say anything, but I saw the subtle tilt of her head, her silent way of asking if I needed help. I shook mine just slightly and turned back to the figs and olives on my sketchpad. "I see you're still wasting time drawing fruit," Vivian said. "No," I said evenly. "I'm preparing visuals for the festival board." They needed something local. I offered no apology, no smile. Just poured 2 small cups of espresso and placed them gently on the table near them. "Sit, if you like. It's Sunday. Gianna makes a wonderful hazelnut tart." Vivian stared at me like I was speaking a different language. "We thought maybe, just maybe, you'd be ready to come home. Learn something useful." I nodded toward the front window. "See that?" The poster for the Artisan Festival caught the sunlight perfectly. My drawing of the town square and dancing children had been turned into something real. It fluttered in the autumn breeze each time the door opened. Vivian's voice sharpened. "You think you're one of them now?" I met her gaze, steady and sure. But I know who I am now." She blinked. That was the moment I knew I'd finally said something she hadn't rehearsed a counter for. Evan shifted uncomfortably. His fingers tugged at the edge of his sweater. "Callie," he started. But I didn't move. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't reach across the table or soften the edges of my truth. Gianna came over with a fresh pour of coffee and placed it quietly in front of me. She didn't acknowledge the others. Evan looked down. For the first time, I wasn't the one apologizing. Have you ever had someone in your life try to shrink you down, just when you were learning to stand tall? They saw a napkin. I saw a story. They saw a sketch. I saw survival. If you've ever been underestimated and still choose grace over anger, leave a comment number 4 below. Let's keep going, because my story isn't over yet. The mayor's assistant asked if I could paint the new label for their community olive oil, while my in-laws sat outside, pretending not to notice. The request came as I was helping Luca set up a booth near the fountain. The assistant, a woman in a crisp linen blazer with olives embroidered at the cuffs, tapped me on the shoulder and said, "We've seen your work. Would you consider designing the new label for our harvest oil?" I blinked, caught off guard. "You'd trust me with that?" She smiled. "You've brought something fresh to this place. The people feel it." I looked past her shoulder. Vivian and Evan were seated at a nearby bench, rigid and out of place amid the music, laughter, and the scent of grilled bread rubbed with garlic. I doubted they recognized the language being spoken around them, not just Italian, but warmth. I wandered through the square, a woven basket on my arm filled with little gifts. Fig jam, rosemary soap, a wrapped wedge of pecorino. Luca introduced me to 2 elders who had grown olives since before the war. One of them squeezed my hand and said, You bring light, like Signorina Meraldi used to, before she passed. I didn't know who Signorina Meraldi was, but I swallowed hard. That kind of compliment wasn't given lightly. Sophia found me just as I was sketching ideas on the back of a flyer. She pressed a small bottle into my palm. "Papa made it," she whispered. "The first press. For you." I hugged her before I could think twice, and she smelled like harvest, sun, crushed leaves, and home. I noticed Evan approaching, his mouth drawn like he had rehearsed a speech. But before he could speak, Sophia threw her arms around my waist. "Callie, did you see the dancers?" He hesitated, nodded faintly, and turned away. Vivian, however, was not one to retreat quietly. "This isn't real," she muttered as I passed. "They'll forget you when the leaves fall." I stopped and turned. "Even if they do, I won't forget how they made me feel." I meant every word, every plate of food, every shared story, every smile. They anchored me in ways no diamond ring or photo frame ever had. Then Gianna stepped forward and said, "Actually, she's staying. With us." They thought they left me here to break me. Instead, they left me where I belonged. The square was quiet now. Vendors were folding up their tables. Children chased each other between leftover banners, and the last of the olive oil tastings had been packed away in woven crates. I sat outside the cafe with Sophia, both of us with sketchbooks in our laps, our pencils moving slowly, like we didn't want the day, or this chapter, to end. Inside, the lights glowed a soft amber. Gianna had closed early, just for us. My newest painting hung near the counter, framed in rustic wood, with a small plaque beneath it that read, "Painted by our own." That phrase alone nearly brought tears to my eyes when she revealed it. Earlier that afternoon, Vivian and Evan had quietly rolled their suitcases out of the guest house. No dramatic words, no apology, not even a backward glance. I had offered no resistance. Evan asked once, "Are you sure you don't want to come back?" And I simply said, "I'm already where I'm supposed to be." It wasn't anger. It wasn't defiance. It was clear. I spent the morning writing a letter, not to them, but to myself. I folded it carefully, sealed it, and took it to the post office, addressed to Callie Branson, Via del Cafe, Florence. Gianna laughed when I told her. "So you'll have mail on slow days?" she said. Sophia handed me a little origami crane, folded from patterned blue paper. "To remember your new home," she said shyly. I hugged her, kissed the top of her head. Later, after the panna cotta and the stories, after the candles had burned low, I slipped into the kitchen behind the cafe. I took out the wrinkled note. "Maybe this time you'll learn," and set it on the edge of the brick oven. One match, a single breath. The paper curled and darkened, then vanished into ash. I stood in front of the mirror near the pantry, hands still dusted with flour. I smiled, a small, steady smile. I'm not the girl who left America. I'm the woman who stayed. And maybe, just maybe, they didn't leave me behind. They left me free. Some lessons arrive wrapped in silence, not in shouting, but in the quiet way people treat you when they think no one is watching. In that small cafe in Florence, between olive trees and second chances, I found something I didn't know I was searching for: belonging. Kindness, even when whispered, has a way of echoing longer than cruelty ever could. And sometimes, the most beautiful part of being lost is realizing you were never really lost, just being led somewhere new. Like a window left open on a warm evening, simple goodness finds its way in. If this story reminded you of a moment you almost gave up, but didn't, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs reminding they matter. And if it sat with you gently, like a letter from an old friend, consider following along, so we can keep unfolding these quiet, unexpected turns of the heart together.